Most of us know of the Roman goddess Venus, or Venus in classical Latin pronunciation. While the idea of a goddess of love and beauty might be very old, calling the goddess Venus is not necessarily much older than Latin. Other nearby pantheons had gods which were considered to be the same person as Venus, which they referred to by a completely different unrelated name. The name Venus comes from a Latin noun meaning something like beauty, so to a Latin speaker she was literally called Beauty. This word for beauty went back at least 3,000 years earlier to Proto-Indo-European, the oldest ancestor of Latin and English that linguists are able to reconstruct. And there it was Venhos. The Proto-Indo-European word had other descendants. In the Indian subcontinent it ended up as Sanskrit Ranas, which also meant beauty. But what if this earlier Venhos had survived into modern English? Sound change is very regular, so we can pretty much just run the word through the Big English sound change algorithm and come up with a likely output. First of all, that laryngeal consonant would be lost, giving Venos. At some point in the first millennium BC, the sound change described by Werner's law would have voiced the final consonant, giving Venos. The vowel in the last syllable would unround and possibly lower slightly to Venos. We now have something that looks like a Proto-Germanic form. The nominative singular ending would eventually erode away, giving first Wena, and then maybe Wena, and then Wen. And as far as I can work out, it would stay as just Wen into modern English, maybe with some fluctuation in the quality of the vowel. The slightly ironic thing is that this ends up sounding more like the actual classical Latin pronunciation Venus than it does like the modern English loaned pronunciation Venus, because the Venus pronunciation is filtered through a load of sound changes that happened in the Romance languages and English after the classical Latin period. As far as Roman gods go, it's a bit hit and miss which ones you can progress into English like this. For a lot of them, the etymology is unclear, or part of the word has been loaned from a non-Indo-European language, so you can't get it back to Proto-Indo-European to begin with. There are famously a couple of classical god names that actually do have native cognates in Germanic languages. A reconstructed Proto-Indo-European root, dieu, meaning the sky or heavens, seems to have been incorporated into a god name, Dieus, or Dieus Pater, Sky Father. The descendants of this are pretty clear-cut. Sanskrit Dieus-Peter, again Sky Father, Latin Jovis or Jupiter, anglicised as Jove and Jupiter, and ancient Greek Zeus, usually without the father bit added. Proto-Indo-European had a system of ablaut, meaning that certain sounds could alternate with each other in certain grammatical contexts. The Germanic word here comes from a different ablaut form of Dieus, which was Dewos. Through regular sound change, this gives Proto-Germanic Diwas, leading to Old English tiu, and the word was sort of fossilised in the word Tuesday, and indeed if it had survived as a word in its own right, we would expect it to be chew if you have a yod coalescing accent like me, or tu if you have a yod dropping accent, or tu if you have a more conservative accent with yod. In before someone in the comments says that I shouldn't coalesce my yods. This chew word is cognate with Zeus and so on, but as I said, it comes from a different ablaut form in Proto-Indo-European, and this ablaut form did actually also survive in Latin as the word Deus, meaning God. This Proto-Germanic word, diwas, survived in Old Norse as tyr, which is probably the form that most people are familiar with in this period of lots of Viking-related media. And this seems to be a relatively minor god in attested Norse mythology compared to the very important roles that Zeus and other cognate characters seem to have in their own respective mythologies. There are lots of possible reasons for this, and my friend Dr. Jackson Crawford has a video on why we should be careful of using classical mythology too much in interpreting Old Norse mythology. So that's an inverted commas actual example of this kind of thing. As I said, a lot of Greek and Roman gods' names are kind of unclear in their derivation. There are plenty of cases where a god's name in one language is cognate with a pretty mundane word in English. Take the Sanskrit word Brahman. Apologies for my Sanskrit pronunciation. This comes from Proto-Indo-European Bergman, meaning something like ascended one, from a root Berg, meaning high. Another word derived from this root, Bergos, gives Proto-Germanic Bergos, a hill. You can see the connection with height there. This then gives English barrow, as in the archaeological feature. Had history taken a different turn, I see no reason why barrow couldn't have meant something quite religious, given that it comes from the nominalisation of the word for high. But what about some names that are closer to home? A host of Old Norse pre-Christian personalities are preserved in myths written down probably some time after most people had stopped really believing them. And we have no such luck with Old English pre-Christian religion, even though presumably a lot of these characters did exist in the West Germanic tradition as well. First, I'd caution anyone against assuming that Old Norse characters and stories can be transferred wholesale into Old English. There's likely to have been a lot of overlap, but these traditions differed from place to place and time to time, even within the Norse-speaking world, so there are bound to be differences lost to time, and it may be that some of these characters aren't attested in Old English because they didn't exist in Old English. There's a lot of value in admitting that we just don't know a huge amount about English pre-Christian religion. But one figure we do know about is Woden, the Old English answer to Old Norse Orðin. Nowadays, people just transpose the Old English word into the closest modern English sounds, Woden. But had the word survived natively rather than being forgotten about and relearnt from books, it almost certainly wouldn't have sounded like that, because this O in Old English does not generally become O in modern English. It would probably have gone into Middle English with the unstressed vowel getting centralised, so Woden becomes Warden. Then around the great vowel shift it would have changed to Woden, and its spelling probably would have settled on something like this. In early modern English, many instances of this long oo vowel get shortened to u, and this was especially common before d. Compare wood, hood, and good. So the vowel would probably have landed in modern English as wooden. This might sound weird because, of course, that is a word in English. Perhaps this would have led to a cultural association between wood and the god, or maybe the pressure would have resulted in people continuing to describe things made from trees using the old word treen instead of wooden to avoid confusion. Old English's answer to the Old Norse word Thor was Thunor. Although belief in this god died with all the others, this was identical to the Old English word for thunder, and barring any weird historical interference, that would have been the word for the god as well in modern English had it survived natively. Eagle-eyed people will realise that it survived in a different form in Thursday. I think this is because it was part of a much longer word, Old English Thunrisday, in particular one that was used a lot, and so it may have been especially vulnerable to non-regular sound changes as people collapsed it in rapid speech. Compare the fact that Wednesday is now Wednesday for, at least in my experience, most modern speakers of English. The equivalent of Old Norse frigg was fri. Remember that g gets palatalised to I after front vowels in Old English. And like the others, this one survives as the fry in Friday. On its own, it probably still would have been fry. It would have gone into Middle English as fri, and the great vowel shift would have broken the long vowel to the modern price vowel. Some other gods that exist in Old Norse mythology don't have clear-cut cognates in Old English. Along with fry, we might have a cognate of Old Norse frøya. This Old Norse word also just meant lady. The Proto-Germanic form of this is kind of uncertain because its reflexes in later Germanic languages don't always completely fit a regular sound pattern. But luckily we have an Old English word that has a similar form and means the same thing, frøwe. So it's surely cognate on some level, even if there's been some weird dialect interference or something. And had this frøwe survived into modern English, it would have been frøwe in Middle English as the final vowel centralised and the o cluster collapsed into a normal diphthong. The weak vowel would have disappeared, frö. The diphthong would have smoothed in early modern English, frö, and then it would have re-diphthongized and the r turned into an approximant in my accent, giving modern fro. One last important god is suitably elusive, Loki. This has no obvious attested cognate in Old English, despite being a fairly important figure in surviving Old Norse mythology. As I say, this doesn't necessarily mean much because Old English pre-Christian religion is known from an almost non-existent residue of written evidence, so lots of figures will have been lost. And the Proto-Germanic origin of this name in Old Norse is not completely known, although there have been, well actually it's not completely known is an understatement, nobody really knows where it comes from. But there are some arguments that it may have been ultimately from a Proto-Germanic word, lukan, a lock. I don't know enough about Old Norse to assess the plausibility of that, but let's say hypothetically it is that, just so we have some kind of result. The Old English word for that is lock, so maybe he'd just be called Lock. Or if you wanted him to be the one who locks, I think that would have to be luka, an agent noun. Morphology people can let me know if I've done that wrong. In modern English, you'd either just get lock Or for the agent noun version, you might expect Lauke, because the long vowel would break with the great vowel shift, and a modern English agent suffix would probably replace the Old English one. With all of these, characters in Germanic mythology often had a handful of names. It's very possible that the normal way of referring to a character might have flipped from time to time, so if these characters had survived, they might have ended up with different names describing some other aspect of their personalities. But I thought this was a fun thought experiment anyway. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll talk to you again soon.